Hello. Hi. It's time. Hi, my name is Wendy Hisco. I'm the director here at Brownell Library, and I wanted to welcome you to this snapshot event, My Day in the Hills, the stories, songs, and soul of the sound of music with Stefanie Weigand. We like to extend our thanks to partners at the Vermont Humanities, as well as generous underwriters who make it possible for us to offer such rich and robust programming. The sponsor of the entire Snapshot season is the Vermont Department of Libraries and the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the Alma Gibbs Donchian Foundation. Tonight's event is also sponsored by the Anne Comer Fund for Women in the Humanities. Tonight we're coming together from across the state to listen, to learn, and to be inspired in community. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items. If you need to use a restroom, you can go to the main desk and they will provide you with a key. If you could silence your cell phones, that's great. This is our last snapshot event of the season here, but there will be one hosted by the Brooks Memorial Library, The Play Instinct, Have You Lost Yours, with Lisa Guerrero at 7 p.m. And you can receive a link to register online for the live stream to that. I want to now take a moment to introduce our speakers. Stefanie Weigand is the Executive Director of Music Comp, a nonprofit organization that promotes creativity and teaches composition to both students and teachers. She enjoys working as a presenter, clinician, and guest conductor across the region and directs Catamount Singers at the University of Vermont, where she is also on the voice faculty. Stefanie currently serves as the chair of the NAFME Council for Choral Education. After completing her BFA in musical theater from Ithaca College, Stefanie toured nationally with the Children's Theater Company and worked on stage and off as a performer, pit musician, music director in New York. Since moving to Vermont, she has appeared as a vocalist, pianist, and music director for various organizations, including Turn Music, the Vermont Philharmonic, Stowe Theater Guild, Lyric Theater, Apex Ensemble, the Green Mountain Mailer Festival, the Champlain Philharmonic, Burlington Symphony Orchestra, and the Green Mountain Opera Festival, and more. So please join me in welcoming Stefanie and as well as Andrew.
Hi, thank you, welcome. I want to make sure that we all know my partner in crime up here, Andrew Crust, who is just coming to the end of his first year as director of the Vermont Symphony Orchestra. They have an incredible program all year long, especially at this upcoming weekend. Andrew, do you want to talk a little bit about
Absolutely. Can you hear us okay? Yeah, what about on the Zoom? You can't tell us either way, can you? Wonderful to have all of you here. So we have a little feedback, that's what we have. Stay back. Well, we need to be near this too, so this is what I'm told. We'll try and work it out. We do have a wonderful program this weekend. It's our season finale, Mozart Requiem. Any of you heard of that little piece? That's part of the program. We have 4 tremendous soloists coming from Canada and the United States, and we're also doing a Nico Muhly world premiere. Nico Muhly is 42, and he's a Vermont-born composer, probably the most successful of all time, I would say. And he's written a new piano concerto for a friend of his, Adam Tendler, who's also from Vermont. They are the same age, and it's based on Justin Morgan's shape note hymns. So it's really going to be exciting. We also have a piece by a living composer, Missy Mazzoli, called Sinfonia for Orbiting Spheres, which is all about imagining how the cosmos might sound in musical form. So it's a bit of an eclectic program. Nothing at all like the sound of music.
No, but you should go see that, though. It's going to be an amazing concert. So let's just jump in.
Let's jump in.
Okay. So we thought we would start today talking about the story. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Von Trapp story and what the differences are between the story we know maybe from the Broadway show, from the film, versus real life.
And I guess you probably all have different entry points. I see some very young people here. I see some people who might have actually seen the show when it came out the very first time, perhaps. No? We'll talk a little bit about our past history with it as well, but I do hope you all have tickets, and I'm sorry that if you don't, they're all sold out. We sold out 3 shows very quickly.
The matinee.
There
are still matinee tickets.
For the matinee? Okay.
More on that later. Last slide.
There is hope. And you might have lived with this piece more as a person who works in theater. I grew up listening to the piece a lot, and I think I probably had the greatest hits from the musical because I didn't even know there were Nazis involved at all. When I was a child, I didn't know, and we'll get into that later as well. But let's talk a bit about their history, and maybe many of you already know about the Von Trapps. But Maria wrote a memoir, which is kind of where this all started, right?
Mm-hmm,
and that was
sure.
it, and I believe in 1949, and she didn't want to write it at first. This is what I've understood.
Very reluctant. Yeah,
Right.
I did get. I've heard about that, and I did get that sense. I've read it, and it kind of seemed like it was a little bit of an fine. Like, people want this for me. I don't know why they would want to know about this. Why wouldn't you? And so she wrote this biography, which then there's this great. Was the BBC witness history episode of a podcast where they're talking to Johannes von Trapp about the story and how all the kids felt about it. He was the youngest of the children at that time, and he said it was like the Hollywood version of the Broadway version of the German film version of the book that my mother wrote, and that it was a little bit like the parlor game, the game of telephone, where someone says something and then someone else whispers it to the next person and the next and the next, and by the time it got to the movie, it was all very different.
And yeah, there's so many differences. I mean, that you probably know or maybe don't know, but for example, he was not a taskmaster, this Von Trapp gentleman. He did not have a whistle that he whistled at his children. He was actually a very loving and gentle man, and she fell in love, actually, just like in the story. She fell in love first with the kids, and then with the man himself. And so that took a little moment, and some of us have been in that situation before. But they were also married, Georg. They married in the 20s and not
Right.
the 30s. So
11 years before the Anschluss.
Right. So
that's not as exciting.
Quite happened.
Right?
Not as exciting. It's not great for a musical. And so in that case, of course, they did not have to flee Austria after the performance. They just took a train in a very relaxed way.
Right. And The Sound of Music, we know, if you've seen the whole show and the movie too, if you had it in the time where it was on VHS, you knew that it was two of them, right? And so the show is already pretty long, so I guess the timeline of the real story would have just made it even longer. So we're going to compress things and we're going to make it a little bit more dramatic so that people will stick around and they'll actually watch the whole show. Right. So they make it a little bit more dramatic and kind of tighten up that timeline. But the timeline was pretty, I would say, dramatically different from real life. 11 years between the wedding and Anschluss is really, really different than the last third of the show.
Right. The things you have to do for theater.
Right,
I
know.
It had to make sense. And then, of course, it's true that they were a musical family.
Absolutely.
That's obviously true. And they performed at the Salzburger Festival, which I don't believe that's actually mentioned in the show, but there's a festival. I don't know if they specify which one. And then they moved to Stowe. Do you know about this? Was it the 40s? Was it around? Was it even? It was they left for Switzerland.
Right. It was in the late 40s. The lodge opened for visitors in Stowe in 1950, but it was in the mid 40s, mid to late 40s, when they actually really settled and bought that property. The thing that I was circling back to about them being musical, they weren't musical because of Maria. This was a musical household from go. This was already a very musical household. Georg encouraged them to be musical with each other. They sang together as a family. So again, not as exciting and dramatic as having someone kind of come in and rescue this family through music, which we love. I love that storyline, but it's just not quite true.
Right. I find it amazing that many children could all sing in tune together.
So do I. I'm a music teacher, and I find that stunning. I love it.
We
Good for them.
That they did. I mean, they sang at the Salzburg Festival, so they must have been okay.
Good.
Do you want to talk a little about your history with this, and maybe I'll do the same thing with this?
Sure, absolutely. So I grew up in New York, in Long Island, and we actually, my mom is here. Hi, Mom. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that the Von Trapps are why we now live in Vermont. it sounds dramatic, and I'm not just doing it for effect. But we started to vacation at the Trapp Family Lodge in Stowe when I was 3. Fact check. Great. When I was 3, we started vacation. I don't remember the before that. So we came to Vermont every year. We went to the Trapp Family Lodge, and much like Georg and Maria, my parents knew there was a piano at the lodge, and I brought my piano music because I couldn't go 2 weeks without practicing. So I had to practice while we were on vacation, which was great. Thank you. But it was really incredible. And then going into middle school, we moved to Vacation Land. We loved it here so much that this is where we decided to relocate and settle here. And of course, I knew the music, and I'd seen the movie about 1,000 times maybe. But you actually spent time, you listened to the music also as a child, but you spent time in Salzburg.
I did. So who here has actually been to Salzburg? Many of you, okay.
Oh.
Been to the festival or just been to Salzburg? Are there things to do in Salzburg besides the festival? Well, I'll get to that later, but exactly.
There you go.
And it is everywhere. But yes, I did. My first relationship with this piece was probably like many people my age. My mother would blast it on the speakers, and like I said, I think I have the short version of the musical because I didn't have every single number, but most of it was there, and she would play it so incredibly loud. That's how I learned solfege, do, re, mi. Most Americans don't know solfege at all, so that's very helpful. And I just fell in love with so much of the music, and I also Rodgers and Hammerstein, who we'll get to. Mm-hmm. That was the first time I ever played in a pit as a musician. Was Oklahoma, and I was playing French horn in high school in the pit, and it opens with a French horn solo, and so that was a first for me. But I did eventually get the chance to spend 2 summers in Salzburg, which for classical musicians is the Olympics of classical music. They not only have their own great orchestras, but they bring in so many great orchestras from around the world. There are 2 or 3 opera productions every week, and I found it bizarre, I must admit, this city in general. Beautiful, so traditional. I think Von Trapp, the character, fits right in, because you could go on a Tuesday afternoon to a matinee concert and people were in their tuxedos on a Tuesday afternoon. And I remember there was this little girl that was so excited. She was sitting up on her seat and she was not being annoying, but she was kind of getting really interested in the music, and this Austrian lady was hissing at her. Oh, no. Sit down, sit in your seat. So I no offense against Austrians here, but I will say I found the environment a little stuffy when I was there in that particular town. Of course, that's a town that is rich in the history of Mozart and Herbert von Karajan and all of these different people, but the festival itself was incredible, and I had full access to all the rehearsals I wanted to go to. And I also had the chance to go up into the mountains. And
did you spin around?
Some of these.
Did you spin
of
around?
Course I spun around.
Good job.
Of course. So I was there. I felt that. But then, this piece also has it's made its way into pop culture, as many of you know. I really like jazz, and when I discovered the John Coltrane version of My Favorite Things, I was very interested in that. I was not so much a fan when Ariana Grande stole it and used it. It's okay, but I just wonder if her listeners know where it's from. That was my fear, was that people would hear, oh, she's got such a great melody she's written. She didn't write it.
She didn't write it. Oh well.
But it's that's sort of my history with the piece. It's soaked into our culture, and I mean Rodgers and Hammerstein in general, I think, are everywhere.
100%. I think it's really interesting. I feel like I would, and I don't know if maybe you did this, I would imagine myself at this festival and just thinking about what it was like for them all those years ago to be in that space.
I wonder how it was different, because now I don't know if they would be featured. It's so classical now, and I'm actually not sure what kind of music they performed at the venue. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to, maybe someone in the audience knows.
Right. I don't know specifically about the festival, but I do know as a family, in general, but especially pre-Maria, in the before Maria times, they sang a lot of folk songs. Maria actually, what she did contribute musically, I'm sure was an incredible amount, but one of the things I noticed that she contributed musically to the family was teaching the children madrigals that she had learned over the years, over her time when she was a nun, and she learned all these madrigals, and she taught them. So the part singing, for sure, was a little bit different than what they had been doing before when they learned their madrigals. But I find that to be, that's really interesting to think about. I wonder if they would even be invited at that
They're
point.
saying madrigals, perhaps.
Maybe. So one of the things that is a little bit of a through line, because we'll be coming back to this a little bit as we continue to talk, is how our personal experiences with material like this shape and influence our lives as we move through. So you were talking about learning solfege, right? And I know as a music educator, one of the things that we teach is do re mi. We use the song do re mi to teach young kids solfege, and also because it's really fun. It's a fun song to learn, and there are hand motions that you can do, so it has all the things. It checks all the boxes as a music teacher. So there are kids just across the country and beyond that grow up with this music, whether or not it's in the context of, oh, that's the sound of music. Who knows? Depends on their teacher, I'm sure. But I think it's become kind of this fundamental piece of us as people as we grow up, which I just find so interesting. I'm hard pressed to pin down another example where a score from a show is in part of everybody's childhood in such a tremendous way, which I find really interesting. And I'm sure there are many people who finally got to see the show or see the movie and went, oh, I know that. And I've listened to interviews doing research for this, that there are a number of people who said, I watched the movie for the first time and I was so surprised to know that I know every single song. I know every song in this show, and I've never seen it before. And I don't know, I can't name another show where that's the case.
Not every major song, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And that's the power of R&H.
Yeah.
What an incredible duo. And I think this was the last thing they wrote together.
It was. Edelweiss was the last song that they wrote together, which is incredible. If you're not already crying during that song in the show, then this will help, right? Just thinking about that. These two, I'm going to put on my musical theater nerd hat for just a short, long moment. These two men here completely changed the game in musical theater. This was probably the longest unit in my history of musical theater class in college. Talking about these two up here. Their time together, Oklahoma came out in 1943. That was their first show together, and The Sound of Music was in 1959, which actually not a tremendous amount of time together, but what they did during that time was unbelievable, really, the shows that they put out. When we think about how they changed the face of musical theater, kind of before this time, this is the golden age, right? Anybody ever hear that term? We talk about the golden age of musical theater. This is why. This is a huge reason why we have a golden age of musical theater. Before this time, there were not a lot of shows with tons of substance, right? If you think of people who were writing before them, I think one of the bigger names that comes to mind, for me at least, is Cole Porter, who was incredibly smart. His lyrics were very witty and very cutting, but the shows that he was writing didn't have a lot of substance or really any plot. But we won't fault him for that. It was the time. A lot of those shows were a star vehicle. Think of trying to pull someone out of vaudeville or out of the Ziegfeld Follies and put them on Broadway. And so they would design the show around a star or around Cole Porter's songs, but not so much because they loved the story. And this really changed with these two men. So in Oklahoma, we're just going to backtrack for a hot second so that we can get to The Sound of Music. In Oklahoma, which was their first show together in 1943, we saw a show that had songs, lyrics, and dances that furthered the plot, which to us now doesn't really seem like a very big deal. And you might think, well, of course they did, because why else would you go see a show? But this was really new. People did not think that they were going to be successful. They looked at the books that they were pulling from, because Hammerstein was not just the lyricist, but also the librettist. So he was writing the book and the lyrics, which again was a little new and different. And he was taking novels and saying, oh, I really like that story. That would make a great musical. And people looked at him trying to figure it out. Like, but where's this? And like, how come we're not doing this? And I don't understand. That story seems kind of sad and serious. Why would you make a musical out of that? But good, thank goodness they did. They had, after Oklahoma, they had Carousel, South Pacific, King and I, Flower Drum Song, Cinderella, which, fine, okay. You're like, why did she throw that in there? All these serious plots, and then Cinderella. But Cinderella broke different boundaries. Cinderella was produced for television, which had not really been done before, and they broke all of the records for TV viewership. So I'm going to give you this number right now, and it's not maybe going to sound like a lot when we think about streaming, but I want you to keep in mind that these people were all watching it live at the same time on one of their 2 TV stations. So there were over 107 million people watching Cinderella when it was first broadcast, which is a lot of people.
Well, at the time, I mean, now we're only 300 million in the country. At the time, we were a lot less. Wow.
That's incredible. So they were breaking boundaries left and right, even with Cinderella. So their music was really pretty cheerful in tone and the lyrics, but they were conquering some pretty serious material. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to get a little bit into the political material of it. On first glance, it doesn't seem like it is, but we have to, I think, frame it in that time when it was written. Not the memoir, perhaps, but the musical itself. But I mean, I'd be more interested maybe now if we could maybe move into the show itself, and we can talk about the vocal writing. You mentioned the fact that the songs further the plot, and I assume you're talking about in comparison to opera, right? Where the arias, or the songs, that's what an aria means, song, they don't further the plot. It's a beautiful moment in time, that sort of time has stopped. The recitative is where the action really happens in terms of moving the plot forward. But this was in the period where opera was branching out, and I think for a lot of these early composers, they didn't consider this to be musical theater, some of them. Bernstein wrote West Side Story. He thought that was a Broadway show, but Candide to him was an opera. Mm-hmm. And then you have Porgy and Bess by Gershwin. And so what is the genre? So I think it branched a little bit off of opera, but this form seems closer to the American people to me than American opera was, at least at that time. Mm-hmm. So I think is that what you meant by the song?
Sure, the plot? Absolutely. It's all of these branches are kind of coming together, and I think musical theater is trying to figure out what it is and mm-hmm. who it's closer to. Are we opera? Are we operetta, light opera? Are we vaudeville? What is it that we're doing? And I think that they just were working it all out. And at the time, they were not dealing with substantial stories that were serious, that had real people. It wasn't happening. It was a lot of, let's do this next song because, hey, this person's really good at tap dancing, so I wrote this song for them, and they're going to sing this. They have these 6 notes that are really great, so that's what this song is. And people love that face, so we're just going to put them on stage. And now we're really touching lives, and we're telling people stories. And that's a huge difference in American musical theater.
And I think that is what operetta did in a way, too. Mm-hmm. It was a lot of people think opera is very serious, but a lot of times there was a famous soprano or tenor. For sure. Let's give them some high C's, and I don't really care what's happening in the story. I just really love hearing them sing. And so this was a direction that we moved into. And I think this is definitely not an operetta, although it seems very friendly on the surface. This is a story about escaping the Third Reich. This is a story about gender roles, about how to parent, about the value of music, all of these things, about religion and facing the choice between religion and life outside of the, you can't call it a nunnery, can you? I don't know. Outside of the convent, that's the word I'm looking for. And they really dig into some of these things. So let's break a few of these down. It's not completely modern, I will say, but you have to remember this was 60s, right? And I think a lot of the mentality fit right into the idea of the 60s in terms of liberating our gender roles in a lot of ways. And the one way that perhaps it doesn't do that is there's one moment in the show I don't really like when Georg is saying, should I take this command with the ship and go work for the Nazis, or should we flee? And she says, dear, whatever you decide will be my choice too. Didn't like that too much. But, you know, that take that for granted because there's so much else in this show. I think about Mother Abbess at the end. Maybe many of you know the plot already. Maria says, I really love this man, and yet I have given myself to this convent. And she says, there are different ways of showing your love for God. And if you love this man, why is that something you should not pursue? And so I think that's bold at the time. What other things struck you?
Maria's character is bold. She is full of grit and determination. She takes no guff, as they say. She has an opinion, and she's not afraid to talk about her opinion. And I've always really enjoyed that about her, and especially about Julie Andrews' portrayal of her in the film in '65. The movie was a little love it or hate it, because folks, you're saying it's a little bit old-fashioned. So I think the film industry in Hollywood in general was advancing, and a lot of people felt like this was pulling us back to the traditional things. But I think you're right. Maria herself is just not to be messed with, especially in the first half of the show. She has her ideas about what is right, and she prioritizes family. She loves these children, and she's going to do anything that she can for them.
And I mean, and it's a story about grief and a person coming to help. After all, Georg, the mother of the original children, they had children together as well, I think, later on. But the mother had passed away, and if you also remember, Frau, oh my goodness, what's her name? I'm forgetting now. Frau Schrader. Yes, Frau Schrader, who is initially his love interest before he meets Maria. She's a traditional choice, right? She's also rich, and there's a great song about that. Obvious choice for political reasons, but this is the 60s, and we're starting to realize, I think, that there are other ways to love, and there are other ways to marry. And the idea of, no, I'm not going to marry this rich person who has, great connections. I'm going to marry some poor nun-to-be from down the street, right? And that at the time it seems normal to us, but I think at the time it was a departure, and that's pretty powerful.
Absolutely, and the two songs you mentioned, Elsa and Max have fantastic songs in the show, which are not in the movie. So if you've only seen the movie, then you should buy tickets to our matinee and come see it because you will hear these two fantastic songs. Just plug that in there. The two songs that Max and Elsa sing are definitely outliers, which I really feel like is why they didn't get plugged into the movie, because they feel different. They're supposed to feel different. So you were talking about How Can Love Survive, which is fantastic. So they're essentially talking about, we're both rich. How will this ever work? We don't have to fight for anything together. We don't have to be poor together and try to think about where we're going to scrounge up our next meal together. We just have everything. So how is this going to even work?
I took that to be sarcastic. That's
yeah. I think it is. I always took it as both. Well, they're like poking fun at it, but they're also like, but actually, the marriage is going to be great. But how can love survive? Because we don't have to scrounge together.
Well, and it's foreshadowing because it doesn't survive, does it? So.
Spoilers. I think it's been out long enough. If you don't know, now you know. And then the other song that they sing together is No Way to Stop It, which I think is definitely the most political song in the show. Right? Basically, Max and Elsa are telling the captain, look, the world is what it is. It's a little bit messed up, but you're going to be fine if you can just sit still and be quiet and let the world be the world. You're going to come out just fine at the other end of this. Yeah. And of course, the captain is like, that feels really wrong to me. I don't agree with you. I can't let that happen. I can't just sit here.
but it digs into the different perspectives. When you see this rise of fascism, there are different ways to respond. There are plenty of people like Max who were disgusted by it, but thought, I have no choice. I have to just stay under the radar. Then you have Rolf, right? Liesel's love interest, who does join the Nazi party, but does not give away the family at the last second. So that's another way. And then you have someone actually fleeing for their life. And so I think it would be easy to just have someone fleeing for their life and the Nazis and nothing in between. But the show, again, digs into some really deep issues.
Because it's complicated. There is no black and white. There's a huge gray area when it comes to making these choices, right? And seeing the world, the way in which we see the world is not easy. It's not always clear cut. And so this song, I think, is the one song in the whole score that really dives into those complicated choices that people have to make. It's not just, oh, we love each other, let's go, let's run away, or, whatever, everything's going to be okay. There's a whole area in between that these people have to weigh lots of choices.
And of course now that's normal, but we just have to constantly frame it, right?
Right.
That was a totally different time, totally different experience. I know you wanted to talk at some point about some of the choral writing, which is very interesting in this piece. It's not fluff at all.
No, it's not. And it's also, I think, not, especially now when we think of ensemble singing in musicals, it's bold, it's bright, but it's also brief. Right, so we've got the end of the song, maybe there's the star singing a song, and then the whole ensemble will come in and support them for the end. And it's a big splashy ending to the song, or it's the opening number, and then it's the closing number, and then we don't really see the ensemble a lot. But this show, this score, has this thread of very traditional choral singing throughout. And the nuns' chorus is that. It's a real chorus. It's not a call to chorus because we're in musical theater, and it's not a Greek chorus. They're not commenting on the show and the story. They are a chorus, and they are singing 4, 6, 7-part choral music, sometimes in Latin. And it's gorgeous. And for me, as a choral director, something that continues to draw me back to this score, because it's something in teaching the music and sitting and listening to the music, something different for my ears to enjoy that I don't get to listen to in a lot of other musical scores. For me, that's very, very exciting. That's my niche right there.
And it fits right in because that would have happened, and it creates a great segue between scene changes, which we won't have. It's not a stage performance, but I think it's brilliant. And also, I'm very impressed with how he wrote for the children. That's not easy, and I think, despite the fact that it is demanding, it's doable, isn't it, for young voices?
Gosh, I hope so. No, it totally is. The writing is fantastic. It's always supported. They're never left to try to find their notes out of nowhere. There's always beautifully supported either by the score or by an older member or a soloist is always kind of handing pitches to the children, which is just really lovely and very thoughtful, I think more so than anyone really gives Richard Rodgers credit for. He could have just been like, oh, this is going to sound really pretty, and then leave them hanging. But it was really, really thoughtfully written, this music for the children. And thinking about that through line of the choral singing, one thing that comes to mind is in the film, and actually, you know what, in the stage production as well, Uncle Max is listening and looking out over the mountains, and he hears the bells of the church and can hear the singing. So the fact that we get to hear the nuns singing off and on throughout is just this little nod to the fact that they were a part of that community. And if you were walking around, you would actually be able to hear them sing.
And you still can in places like Salzburg, actually. Yeah,
Let's go.
Let's go. And one of the biggest takeaways for me about the show is teach your children music. We didn't mention that, but it addresses not only is music nice, but it is a vehicle for them to deal with their trauma of losing their mother. Because when you first meet the kids, you remember, not only has their father trained them like Pavlovian dogs, they're not allowed to express anything. And suddenly, Maria, the very first thing she does with them is sing. And I think that just reminds us all of why we should not be cutting music in schools. And that is a problem everywhere.
Yes. Yes.
And it's, I mean, and they knew it then, we know it now, and I'm just so excited to collaborate with some really young people on this as well, because that experience of singing is really amazing.
Look, some of them are here.
Some of them are here.
Wave to Andrew, say hi.
I know one of our Marias is here as well. So.
We have the team. We have the team today. One of the moments, we spoke about this the other day, and I know Erin, who's here, who's producing the show, we've also spoken about this. One of the small handful of moments that just blanket makes me cry every single time I see this show is, and I'll be fine, is when the children come on singing that reprise of The Sound of Music in all their beautiful part singing, and this kind of stiff, very emotionless captain suddenly loosens up and starts singing with his children, and it is such a beautiful moment. As you mentioned, one of the themes is grief, and so this family is dealing with grief, and the captain is dealing with grief and loss, and in the story, but not in real life, has kind of banned music from the house because it reminds him too much of his former wife. And so this moment where he's able to open up and let go and show emotion to his children and with his children is such a beautiful, poignant moment in the show. It gets me every time.
And music is the vehicle for that, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It is, for sure.
Why do you think this is still popular today?
Oh, boy. Oh, boy. I think we could almost go back to the conversation we were having about all the bullet points about what makes Sound of Music special. I think the fact that we are still learning it as children, that this seed is planted of how beautiful this music is, and how moving this music is, how catchy this music is. Let's not avoid that subject because it is very, very catchy too. It's already stuck in my head. I bet if I started singing "Do a dear," right, we would all be like, "Oh, I know that," right? Exactly. So that is ingrained in us in a very real way from when we are young, and we can't deny that through line in our lives it's there.
You think maybe the music more than the story today?
I think it depends. It's interesting in Vermont communities, especially. I went to school in the Mad River Valley, and I live in Waterbury, so it's between the valley and Stowe. So we're like surrounded on all sides. And I went to school with many of the Von Trapps, and I think that because the family is still so active, they are a part of the community. They are part of our lives here, whether it's just because they're your neighbor or because you see Von Trapp Brewery at the grocery store. They're a part of our lives, and it's real. This isn't as lovely as Oklahoma is. You're not meeting those folks in the street, but we did grow up with family. Like I grew up with some of this family, and so to me, the fact that this story exists, even with all the differences, I think is still extra moving for me because it's real. These are real people that had to make really, really difficult choices. I think we as people hope that we would always make the right choices, whatever that means. We hope that we would make the right choices, and now we get to see a story about a real family who made some incredibly difficult choices and put their family first. I think that, for me anyway, I know that hits home. But also the music is gorgeous.
The music, for me, that's what it is. I think like at the time, they say peak nostalgia is always 20 years after something. And that's sort of 20 years after the war is when this was written. I think before that, you probably wouldn't even be able to conceive of writing anything about the war. It was just too soon. something that has some comedic moments in it, right? So that, I think that's why it was initially one of the reasons so popular. It was just the right moment. And then the people who were alive then taught it to their kids, and my mother taught it to me, and it's just, it keeps passing down. For me, I didn't even, like I said, I didn't even know the story except through the music until I was probably, I don't know, 18 or 19. And that just drew me in immediately, so yeah.
Yeah, we get to be surprised. Like, I do know this entire show.
That's right.
It's amazing. The other thing that I think, again, maybe I'm just making this up, but I also feel like as Vermonters, we tend to be, making a generalization, we tend to be a people who turn to nature when we need to clear our heads. And for everybody, I think that's a little bit different. But from the opening lines of this show, we see Maria feeling very confused, a little lost, and turning to nature to kind of pull things together, to get her head straight, right? So we think about, I promise I'm not going to recite this whole thing, but the very first thing that we hear in the show after the spinning, I'm going to read the text, I'm not going to sing it, so that you can understand the words. My day in the hills has come to an end, I know. A star has come out to tell me it's time to go. But deep in the dark green shadows are voices that urge me to stay. So I pause, and I wait, and I listen for one more sound, for one more lovely thing that the hills might say. And I think there are a lot of people who can relate to that feeling of, I don't know what's going on right now. I need some peace. I need to pull it together. Where do I go? I need to commune with nature. I need to go outside. I need to breathe fresh air, go for a walk, just sit in silence and be with my thoughts. And again, right from the very beginning of this show, we're pulled into that world with her. And I think that's relatable. I think it's relatable for a lot of people, but especially here in the Green Mountains. I think a lot of people understand what that feeling is.
Well said. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I love being in the state, I gotta say, because you can just walk over to those mountains. I also live partially in Vancouver, British Columbia, so I got mountains on both sides.
Oh, both sides.
And you just got to go into them sometimes. So you don't think about that, but that is a big part of the show, actually, the nature connection. And it's mentioned many times. And the nuns are worried about her. She's lost in the mountain, and she says, "I know this mountain better than anyone. I've been here my whole life."
Yeah, I'll never get lost.
Yeah.
Don't worry about me. And then she brings the children. It's like, we have to go for a walk. You need to go outside.
Yeah.
This is too much. Let's go dunk our boat in the lake, right? I love that. Wonderful. Do you want to
open it up?
Sure.
Okay.
So when we were planning this, one of the things that I think would be really interesting, we talked about our experiences with the show, with the story, and what it means to us. I think it would be really interesting to hear from folks that are here. If you have something that, a connection to the story or the show, or a song that you particularly love, or a question about the score for us that we will try to answer without having it in front of us, we'll do our best. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah. No, that's, anything anyone wants to share or ask? Yes.
A couple of things. Can you tell me where the Von Trapps lived before they moved to Vermont?
Where the Von Trapps lived before they moved to Vermont. So they came into New York initially with just a few dollars, is the story. Not the first-hand story, but that's the story. And they actually immediately went on tour.
My mother told me that she used to see them at the railroad station when they were leaving on tour. Now, my mother married in 45, so this has got to be the war years, and I think she was teaching either in New Jersey or Pennsylvania. So I was wondering where this railroad station was. That
Yes.
my mother saw the whole family lined up, getting ready to get on the train.
That's amazing. So your mother would see the family leaving on a train in the 40s. The Von Trapp family. That's amazing.
And then another thing, my mother was visiting in the 70s, and she and I went to the Essex Playhouse
Mm-hmm.
to see the Mousetrap.
Wonderful.
And Maria Von Trapp was in the audience.
That's great. Here to see the Mousetrap in the 70s,
Yeah.
and Maria was in the audience. That's amazing. That's so. See, they're here. Everybody is like has the sighting, you know.
You told me that some of them are still performers.
Yes,
Still musical
absolutely,
performers.
absolutely. And there are many who are going around and performing. Elizabeth performs and beautiful recordings, and you should buy them. And actually, during an interview that I listened to, this is a very strange connection. So Adam Gettle, who is an incredible composer, is the grandson of Richard Rodgers. And it was talking about, he was asked, do you know any of the Von Trapps? You ever met them? And he said, actually, we're very, very good friends with Gardner Von Trapp, who I went to school with Gardner. And that they have this interesting, it's such a small world, especially here in Vermont, that the grandson of Richard Rodgers is friends with Von Trapp, and that they're like, they dine together and they have their families together for events. I find that so awesome. It's very strange, but really cool. Oh, one and then two.
John was washing dishes at the lodge, and he had just gotten a string bass, and they asked him to play along with them.
I wanted to mention that the concert, I was at a benefit concert in '64, was it, or '5, and I was part of the, I'll call it folk relief. It was a bunch of folk tunes, 3 or 4 tunes, and that was my first bass playing ever. But most of the concert was Baroque music, and I was going to ask you if Father Wozner, does that mean anything to you?
Mm-hmm.
I just heard that he was some sort of musical teacher for the family in Europe, and he was there, but I didn't talk to him. But can you tell
Sure.
me
So
about
Father Wozner is essentially who we see in the movie as Uncle Max, because Uncle Max is not a real person. So this Father Wozner was someone who worked with them on their music for I think about 20 years. Worked with the family as they kind of put their act together and toured around. So that was great. So this was in the 60s, and he was there.
Yeah, and I might not have been playing bass fiddle. I just came across 2 of my workers. They were playing guitar and banjo, and there was a bass fiddle player. He had to go to work, so they let me start playing bass fiddle, and that made me decide that I was going to, get into bass fiddle playing, which I did.
Get out. That's amazing. So they encouraged you to get on up there and play, and now it.
And then one of the daughters came along and she said, "Oh, I didn't know you play bass." And I said, "Well, I'm just learning." And then she said, "Well, we're looking for a bass player for the recorder guitar ensemble that I mentioned, the folk music."
Mm-hmm. That's
Did
amazing.
you hear the Hochbrett?
I have not.
It's the Austrian.
Oh, the Hofbräu. Yes.
Hochbrett.
Yes.
Yeah, so they had one of those in that. So that was my introduction to bass playing.
That's amazing. What another great little connection that was. What a small world.
It
What a strange small world. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
So I just wanted to address women in the front row wondering where the family came into, and they actually were sponsored by the Drinker family from Marion, Pennsylvania, when they belonged. And Mr. Drinker had the family stay in his mother-in-law's house across the street from where the Drinker family lived. And he was a patron of the arts, a patron of music, and he sponsored the family. And they would take, that's where they would leave from. They would probably go into Philadelphia to the train station to go on their tours. And then after a while, they did have a house in Germantown, Pennsylvania, and lived there for a while they could perform. They actually moved to Stowe in 1941. That was the actual date. So, and now I have to tell you, because you're probably wondering why I know this. You know, right? You know. Okay. So I'm Gardner's aunt. I'm married into the family. This is Elizabeth von Trapp, the real person, and her husband, Ed. So.
Thank you for telling us that after the talk.
Yeah, you noticed you didn't interrupt. So they actually started out in Pennsylvania and then eventually moved to Vermont. And my husband and I worked up at the lodge before it burned down in 1980, and we would have conversations with people coming through. And of course, there was such a focus. This would be 1975, so only 10 years after the film came out, and then everyone should remember the play was in 1959. So even earlier than 20 years after the end of the war, it was really only 14 years when the play was presented. And just a little aside, the photo at the top, that's Elizabeth running behind Mary Martin, and my husband running ahead in a hat. And that photo was published in Life magazine.
All right, so this is the photo that's on. So when you went online to register to come here, there's a beautiful photo, and that's the photo that we're talking about right now. Great.
One of the things that people would engage. I'm a horticulturist, so I'd be in the gardens, and people would engage and talk, and they always wanted to know, are you a Von Trapp? And at that point in my life, at 50 years, I'd say sort of, but I'm married in the family. But at that time, it was very uncomfortable for me because, it was all because of the film. But what many people, I think what resonates for so many people is that the story of the Von Trapps is an immigrant story. And they had the good fortune to be sponsored. And what we're experiencing in Vermont today, we are only in recent decades has Vermont welcomed refugees into the state. And I think the example that was set by the Drinker family in Pennsylvania is an example that perhaps we all need to follow to welcome those fleeing horrific conditions, who are in great need of financial, physical, emotional support. And I think that's part of why this film, why the play resonates with so many. And it is fiction based on fact. We know that so much of it is fiction, but the bare bones is factual. And I think people respond to the fact that Elizabeth's grandfather had the courage of his convictions to stand up to Hitler and to say no. And we all sometimes need to learn to say no. You may or may not know this, but they had to sing for Mussolini in Italy. And all the members of the family who are now gone, and speaking with them, Elizabeth's aunt, Maria, not the Maria of the movie, but we'll call her Mitzi, because that was her former nickname, and that's, she wasn't allowed to be Maria because it was too confusing. She told, she would tell these stories, of how this was, such a horrific thing, but for their own well-being and safety, they were required to sing for him. So I'm kind of rambling, and
No, not at all. You're not rambling at all. I think that touches on a little bit of what we were talking about before, that we hope, I think, for ourselves, when we look inward, we hope that we would make those choices. And I think you're right. We do know, like, this is a Broadway show, or this is a film, where whatever your pathway is into the story, and real people. And again, I think that we are forced, because of that, we're forced to look inside and really think about how we would respond if we were in their shoes. And I think that kind of just, it's what sets this show apart from so many others, is that it really does make us think a little bit harder after we see the show, after we listen to the music, more so than, gosh, I mean, literally anything, but even one of the more serious shows like Oklahoma or Carousel, we understand that this is real. And we just hope that if we were in their shoes, we would make the same tough choices.
And that's, I think, what makes a great work last for decades and centuries, is it still remains relevant somehow.
Of course.
And there's nothing in the show that doesn't remain relevant today.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, in some cases, yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions,
We have,
thoughts?
Jacob, we have just like
We have 1 minute.
Is it? Okay. We got the thumbs up. Is there anything else? Any other connections, stories?
I have a question.
Yes.
At the first slide, did it mention a German film, initial German film
Mhm.
about it?
Yes.
And have you heard
I have
that
not
any place or?
I have not seen it. Have you guys seen this? Has anyone seen the original film? Elizabeth has.
Yes. So I'm Elizabeth von Trapp, so I am the daughter of Werner von Trapp, who would be Kurt in the movie. And as a child, I remember visiting my grandmother, Maria. So she was my step-grandmother, but there was no distinction in my heart or in the telling. We understood, but there was never the sense of she was less than our grandmother. So very importantly, we would go visit, and my Aunt Hedwig was a part of the management there, and that was, I don't know if you met my Aunt Hedwig at that time that you were working there.
I don't remember them.
Oh, okay. They were very involved in all of the work and duties and management, and there was a very specific, with the St. George's Hall was the reception hall that was built on for folk dancing and for family gatherings, and that's where the piano was. That's where you did your
Where I
rehearsing.
was forced to practice.
Forced to rehearse. Yes, well, in that room on the weekends, Friday night, the film was set up for guests. And if we came to visit Saturday or Sunday and it be raining, my aunt would just feather in that film and play it for us so we would calm down so that adults could keep sharing and catching up over a brunch. And so we saw both films. There was a sequel, and it was one of our favorite films. Hans Holt plays the part of my grandfather, and he was so handsome, and I thought, oh, he's perfect for my grandfather. And Ruth Leuderich was she was like Audrey Hepburn kind of star in her day. Perfect couple to play that part. What was very different watching that film, it was much more in keeping with the actual storyline of my grandmother's book, The Story of the Trapp Family Singers. And we just delighted in seeing how real and how extended the storyline was taken. So when we did go to see The Sound of Music, we saw how clipped and changed and modified and embellished it was. And I remember coming out of seeing The Sound of Music for the first time, and we were standing around my father. I remember it was snowing. It was in November, so it's lightly snowing. The snow is piling up on my father's shoulders. He's dusting it off. We say, so what do you think, Papa? What do you think? He goes, I don't remember any of this.
That's fantastic. I don't remember any of this.
I'm very grateful for your presentation. There's one line that comes to mind in The Sound of Music where the captain says there's no time at the end when they have their program there. He must make time to convince the officials that are coming. And Maria says, will just have to make time. And that was always my favorite line when I played the part of Maria. And I felt like it was really important for us to come and make time to hear what you had to say, because it is my work that I'm doing and putting together my impressions. You had the perfect questions in the very early part. Emotionally, how does it figure in? And it is probably one of my greatest joys of figuring out how I fit in. And it's a real story that sometimes people live an authentic life and it keeps living beyond their lives. They're all buried, they're all gone. But their soul and their spirit lives on in us through the story, through Rodgers and Hammerstein. Everybody is meant to shine, those that have brought beauty to the world or brought something to make a difference. And I'm always trying to figure out what am I supposed to do? Thank you for
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for sharing. Okay. I'm fine. Yes, please.
Was sponsored and living in Marion, Pennsylvania. Well, Oscar Hammerstein had a home in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, which is not so far away. And the family gave a Christmas concert in the home mansion in Doylestown. Martha Mercer, who's sister-in-law to the guy who has the Mercer Museum there. But I find it very ironic because we don't know whether perhaps Oscar Hammerstein heard them sing. I mean, they're in the same town and this was a musical event. Was he invited to this Christmas party? I don't know, but that's a little sidebar there.
I'd like to imagine that.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting to imagine, isn't it?
Someone will investigate that for their thesis.
Yes.
All those young people out here. Shall we?
Shall we do something?
Shall we do this?
Shall we do a little,
We thought it would be really lovely. Oh no, sorry. We thought it would be really lovely. Get your tissues there, friends in the back row. Oh, we haven't started singing yet. It's already happening. To just because we are here to talk about the music, I think I would be really sad if we didn't actually make any music together.
don't look at me, they're singing
Okay.
too.
And Andrew's going to step right up to the microphone and sing this solo for you.
Yes. You gotta give us the pitch though.
Oh, I do. Shall I pick a really nasty key? No. How about Edelweiss? Let's all sing. Edelweiss. Every morning you greet me, small and white, clean and bright. You look happy to meet me. Blossom of snow, may you bloom and grow. Bloom and grow forever. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, bless my homeland forever. That's beautiful harmony. If you're wondering, that's the second big time in the show that I just,
Of course.
I kept it together today though. No, that's important. That is important to know if you didn't already know that. Not actually an Austrian song. That is a Rodgers and Hammerstein original. I mentioned at the beginning it was the last song that they wrote together, which I think also just really lovely and moving. So we have really important people in the audience. All of you are really important people in the audience. We also have our friends from Lyric and the VSO, our stage manager, some cast members. And of course, Andrew, who will be conducting the show when we get to that point next month. It's May. Next month, the show is next month. Hooray! So apparently, well, we added a show because it sold out so fast. So there's a matinee on that Saturday, the 22nd, that still has some tickets I'm getting nods about. Wonderful. So I hope you join us. And if you do, please come and say hello and, track us down while we're there.
Thank you all so very much, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Vermont Humanities.